I didn't plan for Vietnam to change me. At first, it was just another place on the map, far away, tropical, exotic. I had seen the pictures, of course, shared by friends who'd visited. Lanterns glowing in the dark, ancient temples carved into hillsides, street vendors smiling beneath straw hats. Their captions always said the same thing: the kindest people I've ever met. A place that feels like home. You have to see it for yourself. I believe them, but only in the way someone believes in the beauty of a place they've never touched. It felt distant, like a dream that belonged to someone else. Still, something in me stirred. I began to read more, scrolling through travel blogs and guidebooks. The more I learned, the more Vietnam became not just a destination, but a question. What makes this country so different? Why do so many people leave it changed? The surface was beauty and warmth, but what lay beneath? I wanted to know. Then came the stories I wasn't looking for. Old articles, war records, veteran accounts, whispers of soldiers who vanished in the jungle without explanation, reports of strange lights, ancient trails, caves that locals refused to enter. It was curiosity at first, but then I met Mr. Franklin. He was my neighbor, quiet, alone, always sitting on his porch with a distant look in his eyes. He noticed what I was reading, said he'd been there long ago, said he'd seen things he couldn't explain. His voice was soft, almost reluctant, but there was something in it that stayed with me. He couldn't go back, but I could, so I booked a flight, not just to see the country, but to follow the shadows he left behind. The air was warm when I stepped out of the airport, not just warm in temperature, but in mood. I didn't know how else to describe it. It was something about the way the light hung low over the buildings, the way strangers smiled at me without a reason. Vietnam greeted me not as a guest, but as if I had been expected. The streets were alive, noisy, busy, colorful, but I didn't feel lost in them. I felt absorbed, welcomed, like the city had made space for me. I arrived in a coastal town in central Vietnam, where a friend of a friend had helped me book a guest house near the shoreline. The town wasn't in any major guidebooks. It had no big resorts, no airport, no crowded attractions. But that was exactly what I wanted. It was quiet, slow, and entirely itself. The houses were painted in soft yellows and gentle greens, their shutters wide open to catch the breeze. Children played in narrow alleyways. Old men sat in front of cafes, sipping coffee thick as molasses. Every corner smelled of grilled fish, spices, and something sweet I couldn't name. I spent my first few days simply wandering. I took long walks by the beach, where the sand was white and the sea impossibly blue. I tried every local dish I could point to. I learned a few Vietnamese phrases from the staff at the guest house, who laughed every time I got the tones wrong, but always encouraged me to try again. My world, once so carefully structured, began to dissolve. Here, nothing was on time, but everything had rhythm. Everything flowed. I had come expecting to observe. Instead, I found myself swept in. But then came the stillness. On my fourth day, I woke before dawn and walked inland, past the last cluster of homes, into the edges of the forest. I hadn't meant to go far. I just wanted quiet, a moment to breathe, but something about the trees called to me. I walked until the path disappeared, replaced by soft earth and fallen leaves. Birds fell silent. The air thickened. I didn't feel unwelcome, exactly. Just watched. Not by people, not by animals. Just watched. I turned back quickly. That night, I remembered Mr. Franklin's voice. There are places in that jungle, he'd said once, where even the trees seem to hold their breath. I shook it off, blamed the heat, the jet lag, the weight of too many new impressions, but something lingered. The next day I met Leo. He was tall, deeply tanned, and looked like he belonged in every travel magazine ever published. He wore loose linen shirts and had sun-bleached hair tied in a careless knot. We were both waiting at a roadside stall for iced coffee when he noticed the book in my hand. A small journal I used to jot down things I wanted to remember. "You write?" he asked, his accent unmistakably Californian. "A little," I replied. surprised to hear a familiar voice. That's how it started. We shared a table under the shade. He told me he was a travel vlogger, just passing through. He'd come with a group of friends, all seasoned travelers, hopping from country to country while filming short documentaries on hidden places and local legends. His current project? A mini-series on unexplained phenomena across Southeast Asia. And yes, he added with a grin, Vietnam was full of them. Over the next few days, we ran into each other often. At the beach, at the food stalls, in the tiny bookstore tucked behind a row of lantern shops. Soon, he introduced me to his crew. Max, quiet and reserved, always carrying gear and maps. June, sharp-witted and intuitive, the only other woman in the group. And Dylan, the energetic one, who never stopped joking, even when no one laughed. They invited me to join them for a local hike, just a short trek inland, into one of the less touristy forest areas. They had heard from a contact about an old trail that cut through dense jungle and ended near a cluster of caves that weren't on any official maps. According to the locals, the caves were sacred, once used by village shamans for rituals long forgotten. Most people didn't go there anymore. Some said the paths changed each time you entered. It's probably just superstition, Leo said, his tone light, but it makes for good footage. I hesitated. Mr. Franklin's stories echoed in my mind, but June leaned in. We're not doing anything reckless. We'll stick together, have local guides, supplies, just a little mystery chasing. You in? And I was. I'd come to learn, to feel, to experience. I said yes. The night before we left, I couldn't sleep. I sat outside the guest house, riding under the flickering yellow porch light. I remembered the last real conversation I had with Mr. Franklin before I left. He had brought out an old photo, creased, faded, black and white. A group of young men in uniforms stood in front of what looked like a thick jungle. Some smiled, some didn't. That was us, he said quietly, right before the last patrol. He pointed to one of the faces. He never came back, just vanished. No gunfire. No sign of struggle, just gone. He didn't say it to scare me. It was more like a confession, a wound he'd lived with for decades. But you'll be fine, he added, suddenly smiling. That country's changed. It breeds peace now. Just be respectful. Don't try to force your way where you're not invited. That sentence stayed with me. The next morning, we left before sunrise. Our group packed lightly but prepared. We had water, food, flashlights, GPS trackers, and a small printed map from a local contact. We followed the same road I had walked days ago, past the last houses, into the thicket. This time, we didn't turn back. At first, it was like any other hike. We moved in silence, the forest humming around us. The deeper we went, the more the air changed. The path narrowed, the light dimmed, filtered through thick canopies. Every so often, we marked trees with chalk, just in case. Max logged our coordinates. June photographed fungi and strange moss patterns. Dylan filmed everything, occasionally whispering commentary into his mic. Then, the GPS began to flicker. We stopped, checked batteries, reset devices. Nothing worked. June frowned. We haven't gone that far. There's no reason for a signal drop. But there it was. Dead silence on the screen. No signal, no location, only static. We pressed on. A few hours later, we found it. An opening in the trees. Almost too perfect. The start of what looked like an ancient trail, overgrown but walkable, winding downward into shadow. It wasn't on the map. Not exactly. Leo looked back at us. This is it. No one spoke. Then, we stepped forward. We moved in single file. The trail was too narrow for anything else. Vines snaked down from the branches above. The trees grew thicker, their trunks gnarled and twisted, as if shaped by unseen hands. The forest floor was soft and uneven, strewn with old roots and broken stones. No one spoke for the first 20 minutes. There was only the sound of our steps. You see, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot, and the distant call of birds we didn't recognize. Even Dylan, always filming, kept his voice low. After a while, the light began to change. It wasn't just the canopy overhead. Something in the air shifted. The color of everything dulled. Shadows deepened. The air grew humid, clinging to our skin like wet silk. I checked my phone out of habit. Still no signal. The compass app spun in slow circles. June was the first to say it. "This doesn't feel right." Leo turned. "We've barely started. You okay?" She nodded, but her face was tense. "Just feels off, like we're not alone." Max paused beside a fallen tree. "Probably just nerves. This kind of place does that. It messes with your senses." But I felt it too. The same presence I had sensed days earlier when I wandered too far alone. Not hostile, not friendly, just there, as if the forest itself was aware of us, following. The trail led us downhill, then veered sharply to the left. We passed a cluster of standing stones, 3 of them, arranged in a triangle, covered in moss and carved with faint patterns. Dylan stopped to film them. "Look at this. These aren't natural." He reached out to touch one, but Max stopped him. "Don't." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "What? You think they're cursed?" "No," Max said flatly. "I think you don't touch things when you don't know what they are." We moved on. By midday, we found a clearing. It wasn't large, just enough space for us to sit and drink water. There was a strange silence here. No insects, no birds, just the soft hiss of wind moving through the trees like breath. June sat apart from the group, her hands clasped tight. She looked pale. I walked over and sat beside her. "You all right?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "I think I saw something earlier. A figure between the trees." "Like an animal?" "No," she whispered. "Like a man, but wrong." I didn't ask what she meant. I remembered Mr. Franklin's words about seeing figures that never came close, that watched from a distance but never made a sound. We rested briefly, then continued. The trail narrowed again, sloping downward into thicker brush. The air grew colder. My ears popped, as if we were descending into something deeper than just terrain. Leo led confidently, but I noticed he kept checking the chalk marks we'd left on trees, some of which had faded or disappeared entirely. We reached a fork in the path. To the left, a narrow passage overgrown with vines. To the right, a darker trail, framed by 2 leaning trees like a gateway. Max studied the map, frowning. "This isn't on here," he said. "Neither direction matches the terrain we planned for." Leo shrugged. "We follow instinct." "That's not a strategy," Max replied sharply. "We're not lost," Leo insisted. Dylan laughed. "Yet." Tension sparked in the air. The unity we'd had earlier was fading. The forest was doing something to us, stretching time, bending paths, testing patience. We chose the right-hand path. The trees closed in. I felt the space shrink around us, like we were being funneled into something tighter. The trail curved sharply and opened onto a shallow ravine. Across it, embedded into the rock face, was an opening. A cave. We all stopped. It wasn't large, maybe 6 feet high, framed in stone and shadow. Vines draped across the entrance like curtains. Faint marks lined the rock, symbols scratched into the surface, worn by time and rain. Leo stepped forward, brushing the vines aside. "This is it." Inside, the air was cold and still. We switched on our flashlights. The beams cut through darkness, illuminating smooth walls and narrow corridors. The floor was uneven, damp. A smell lingered, earth, stone, and something older. We moved carefully, staying close. In one chamber, we found remains of what looked like an altar, a low stone platform, circular, with faded red stains and scattered fragments of wood and cloth. Max examined it silently. June refused to go near it. "I don't like this," she said. "We shouldn't be here." Leo scanned the room with his light. "This is amazing. It's untouched." Dylan recorded everything. "Guys, this is gold." I felt a pressure in my chest. Not fear exactly, but a tightness, like being watched, like being warned. Max found something carved into the far wall, lines forming a spiral, surrounded by shapes like eyes. He traced them with his fingers, then backed away quickly. "These are recent," he said. "Not ancient. Someone's been here." We froze. Leo tilted his head. "Locals?" "No, there's no dust on the floor. Tracks are fresh." A sound echoed from the corridor behind us. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps. Slow, deliberate. We turned as one. The corridor was empty, but the tapping continued. We didn't run. We walked, quickly, silently, back through the cave, retracing our path. The light at the entrance felt like salvation. Outside, the forest seemed darker than before. The wind was still. Even the insects had gone quiet. Max spoke first. "We should go back." Leo hesitated. "We haven't finished." "No," Max snapped. "We go back. Now." No one argued. We retraced our steps, following chalk marks, or what remained of them. Some had been smeared, others vanished. The trail felt unfamiliar, though we knew we had walked it before. The light began to fade. Evening came quickly in the jungle. Then the rain began. It wasn't sudden. It started with a slow mist, then thickened into sheets. The path turned to mud. Roots became slick. Visibility dropped. Our flashlights barely pierced the downpour. June slipped, falling hard. Her ankle twisted. She cried out in pain. And we stopped, tried to help her walk. Leo took most of her weight. Max checked the GPS again, still dead. Then the compass needles spun wildly. We were no longer sure which way was back. We found temporary shelter under a rock overhang. The rain didn't stop. Thunder rolled in the distance. Lightning flashed behind the trees. We were soaked, cold, lost. That night, we camped beneath the overhang. No fire, just a single flashlight between us. We didn't speak much. June was shivering, wrapped in a plastic poncho. Dylan stared into the dark, lips pressed tight. Max kept checking equipment, as if willing it to work. Leo sat beside me, silent. I looked at him. "Do you think we'll get out?" He didn't answer. Instead, he handed me something. A photo, folded, worn, black and white. 4 men in uniform standing in front of a jungle. One of them looked like Mr. Franklin. Leo's voice was quiet. "My grandfather. He was here, same area, disappeared for 3 days. Came back, changed." I stared at the photo. He never talked about it, just told my dad to never go near this region. Said there were things here that don't like to be found. Thunder cracked overhead. Leo folded the photo and put it away. We slept in shifts. That night, I dreamed of a voice calling my name, not from the outside, but from within the trees. Morning came with a thick fog that swallowed everything beyond a few feet. The forest no longer felt like a place. It felt like a maze, suspended in mist and silence. Our bodies were sore, damp, and tired. None of us had slept well. Even the insects had gone quiet again. The usual rhythm of the jungle was missing, as if nature itself was holding its breath. June's ankle had worsened overnight. She could barely stand. Leo crafted a crude splint with branches and cloth, but every step she took drew a wince. Dylan offered to carry her, but Max quickly shut that down. "You'll both fall," he said, his voice sharper than usual. "We need to think clearly." That was the problem. No one was thinking clearly anymore. Small arguments erupted, over direction, over water, over rest breaks. Trust had begun to erode. The compass still spun uselessly. The GPS blinked blank screens. Even the map, once our backup, had smeared beyond recognition from the rain. Every direction looked the same now. Trees, mist, silence. We moved slowly, half carrying June, calling out periodically in hopes someone nearby might hear. A rescue team, a villager, anyone. But the forest gave nothing back. No echoes, no birds, no signs of life beyond our own. Around midday, we found something unexpected. A tattered piece of cloth caught on a low branch. Camouflage, faded, Torn. The pattern unmistakable. Military issue. Not recent. Max froze when he saw it. That's not ours. Leo stepped closer, gently prying it free. The fabric was old but intact. Mud-stained, weather-worn, but still bearing the outline of a U.S. Army patch. Dylan exhaled. This can't be from today. I said nothing, but my heart was racing. Mr. Franklin's photo flashed in my mind, the way his fingers had lingered on his friend's face, the one who never came back. We pressed on, less certain of our steps now. The trail, if it could still be called that, twisted around a narrow gully. Vines hung low, brushing our faces. The fog thinned slightly, revealing shapes in the distance. Stones arranged unnaturally, almost like markers. Someone, or something, had been here before us. Then we saw the tree. It was massive, roots fanning out like fingers, trunk wide enough to hollow. Carved into its bark were more symbols, spirals, hands, eyes. But these were fresh, scratched recently. The wood still raw. June stopped walking. No more. We have to stop. Leo turned, frustration in his voice. We stop every hour. No, she said, trembling. We stop for real. We turn around. To what? Max asked bitterly. We don't even know which way is forward anymore. June's eyes filled. This place, it doesn't want us here. Silence fell. Then Dylan, who had wandered a few steps off, called out, Guys, you need to see this. We followed. He stood at the edge of a small clearing. In the center was a structure, wooden, collapsed in places, but unmistakably man-made. A hut, long abandoned, covered in moss and rot, but still holding shape. The door hung loose. One window had no glass. Max stepped forward slowly. Military outpost? Or shelter, Leo said. Someone tried to survive here, and we approached cautiously. Inside, the air was musty. Cobwebs coated the corners. On the floor, half buried in dirt, was a rusted metal box. Max pried it open. Inside were scraps of paper, molded, nearly unreadable, and a dog tag. He brushed it clean. The name was faded, but there, etched into metal, was a partial ID. U.S. Army. Serial number still legible. Leo took a step back. This is real. I reached into the box and pulled out one of the papers. It crumbled slightly, but some of the ink remained. The handwritten note. We haven't seen the others in 3 days. Supplies low. Something out there. Doesn't leave tracks. Keeps watching at night. Some of the men are hearing things. I stopped reading. Dylan was already filming. Max told him to stop. Dylan ignored him. Leo yanked the camera from his hands and turned it off. We're not here to exploit this. Then why are we filming anything at all? Dylan snapped. You think this is fun now? Leo's voice cracked. You think this is a game? Dylan didn't answer. Tension exploded between them. Harsh words, accusations, old wounds resurfaced. I didn't know their full history, but whatever had been holding them together was unraveling fast. I stepped outside to breathe. The forest felt thicker here, heavier, like it had closed around us completely. I looked at the sky, gray, unmoving. No birds, no sun, just endless, stagnant air. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft, like wind, but wrong. My name, not shouted, not even spoken, just breathed. I turned, heart racing, no one there. I walked back inside, didn't mention it. That night, we didn't set camp. We stayed inside the hut. No fire, just our flashlights. June dozed fitfully. Max sat by the door, keeping watch. Dylan curled into himself, no longer filming. Leo rested near the wall, silent. I couldn't sleep. Sometime after midnight, I saw movement through the window. A figure, standing just beyond the clearing. Still, watching. I blinked. It was gone. Morning came slowly, bleeding gray light through the mist. The hut seemed smaller, tighter, like the forest was pressing in. Leo spoke first. We head north. Terrain slopes up that way. We might reach higher ground. No one objected. We walked in silence, following the incline, past fallen logs and thick undergrowth. The forest changed again. Trees twisted into arches. Stone formations rose from the ground like broken teeth. Then we found the cave. It wasn't like the one before. This one was narrow, half hidden behind a curtain of ivy. The opening gaped like a mouth. Cold air flowed from within. We paused. "Is this it?" Dylan asked. Max checked the map. "No, this isn't on it." Leo looked at me. "What do you think?" I didn't answer. My chest ached. My hands were shaking. Something about this place felt final, but I nodded. We entered. The passage sloped downward. The walls were damp, marked with lichen. Our lights flickered. June stumbled. Max caught her. Deeper inside, the tunnel widened into a chamber. In its center stood a stone altar, similar to the one before, but grander. Symbols lined the walls. Faint light glowed from cracks in the rock. Bioluminescence, maybe, or something else. On the floor were carvings, patterns that spiraled inward, converging at the center of the altar. Dylan stepped forward. "Don't," Max warned, but Dylan didn't stop. He reached the altar and touched the center. The lights pulsed. A deep hum filled the air, like a heartbeat inside the stone. We froze. Then everything stopped. Silence. Darkness. Our lights died. And then, slowly they flickered back on. The altar was empty. Dylan was gone. The air inside the cave remained still, almost suspended, like time had paused the moment Dylan touched the altar. The echo of the moment hung over the chamber in a silence that screamed louder than any cry. No one said anything. There was no panic, no gasping, just an overwhelming stillness as each of us tried to comprehend the absence of someone who a breath ago had stood right before us. We scanned the chamber, our flashlights sweeping the stone walls, the crevices, the ceiling. There was no tunnel, no trap door, no sound of footsteps retreating down some hidden path. He had vanished without disturbance, as if the air itself had consumed him. My pulse quickened. A cold sweat spread across my back. My mind tried to reason. Illusions, a trick of the light, some hidden passage, a hallucinatory experience shared by all. But no matter how many theories I cycled through, none held up. There was no logic that could explain what had happened. I wanted to believe he had run ahead, that he'd be waiting at the exit with a smirk and a story, that we were just overreacting. But deep down, something older and colder than fear whispered otherwise. I tried to hold on to rational thought, but I was losing grip. My stomach tightened with a sickening realization. Something had taken him. Something not interested in being understood or explained. And as much as I didn't want to admit it, I felt responsible for not warning him, for not stopping him, for not heeding the warnings from the moment I stepped into this place. Max moved first. He stepped forward, hands trembling but composed, scanning the altar for mechanisms or seams or any sign of disturbance. Leo circled the perimeter with the flashlight, examining the walls with growing frustration. June sat slumped against the far wall, her face pale and empty, as if a part of her had broken loose and drifted out of reach. The cave pressed in from all sides, not in size, but in presence. It was alive in some way I didn't understand, not with breath or heartbeat, but with memory, with the weight of rituals long forgotten and warnings long ignored. We didn't speak of leaving right away, though it was clear none of us wanted to stay. We didn't call Dylan's name. Something about it felt pointless. I couldn't help but feel that calling would only draw more attention to ourselves, unwanted attention. My thoughts raced, looping back to Mr. Franklin and the story he never finished telling. He had paused mid-sentence when I asked what had happened to his missing comrade. His eyes had gone far away, and he had said, "Some disappearances aren't meant to be solved. They're warnings." Now I knew what he meant. As we stumbled out of the cave, the air outside didn't feel like relief. It felt heavier, denser, like we had crossed a threshold not meant for us. The trees looked the same, but the silence had changed. It no longer felt like a pause. It felt like a verdict. The path we had followed earlier was gone. The moss and leaves had shifted, hiding whatever marks we had left. It was as if the forest had swallowed our trail the moment we looked away. We wandered aimlessly for hours, trying to find a landmark or elevation change to guide us. Everything looked the same. The light filtered through the canopy in dull, endless gray. I started to wonder if we were walking in circles, retracing our own steps unknowingly, caught in some cruel loop. Desperation crept in slowly, like cold seeping through clothes. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and every breath felt heavier. We rationed water, but it was clear our supplies wouldn't last much longer. June's injury slowed us, and we had to stop frequently. Leo tried to stay optimistic, offering solutions, suggesting that if we just kept moving, we'd break through the perimeter eventually. Max grew quieter with each passing hour, studying the compass, even though we all knew it had long stopped being reliable. I began to withdraw into myself, drowning in the static of my own mind. In that silence, my thoughts turned inward. I began to ask myself what I would do if we never made it out. What would my family think? Would they believe I'd gotten lost, wandered off a trail? Or would they assume something worse? Would anyone believe the truth if it were ever known? Part of me hoped they would never find my camera, never uncover our footage, because what we had seen deserved not to be explained, but respected and left untouched. I thought of Mr. Franklin again, sitting alone on his porch, holding that old photograph. I understood now the weight he carried all those years. The silence in his words wasn't fear, it was reverence. He had seen something that didn't belong in the world of logic and language, and now I had too. I wished I could talk to him one last time. I wished I had listened more carefully when he tried to prepare me. I wished I hadn't come, not because I regretted seeking truth, but because I had misunderstood the nature of it. I had come to document, to learn, to explore. But there are truths that don't want to be uncovered, truths that only exist to test the arrogance of those who think everything is meant to be known. By the second night, our bodies began to fail. We were weak, moving only in short bursts, resting often. The forest grew darker earlier now, or perhaps time had lost its meaning. The air felt thick with moisture, the kind that clung to your skin and never let go. I couldn't sleep, not because of fear anymore, but because of what I began to hear in the silence. It wasn't voices, not exactly, more like memories of voices, buried deep inside the stillness. They didn't speak words I understood, but they carried emotion, grief, warning, sorrow. I began to wonder if the forest itself remembered those who had come before us, if it carried the weight of all those who had never left. And then the visions began. Not in dreams, but in waking moments, flashes in the corners of my eyes, shadows that moved against logic. I saw figures walking between trees, too tall, too thin, their limbs bending at odd angles. I saw symbols carved into bark that disappeared when I blinked. Once, I saw Dylan standing just beyond a thicket, his back turned, motionless. I blinked and he was gone. I didn't tell the others. I wasn't sure if I was losing my mind or glimpsing something meant to be seen only by those close to the edge. That night, as I sat alone on a mossy rock, while the others tried to sleep, I began to whisper to no one. Not prayer, not confession, just whispers of desperation. I asked whoever or whatever was watching to let us go, to let us leave in peace. I promised I wouldn't return. I promised I would carry the story with care, that I would not exploit what didn't belong to me. I asked them to return Dylan, even if it meant taking me. I cried quietly, letting the tears fall freely, not out of terror, but out of surrender. Then something changed. The wind picked up, not in a storm, but a breath. A cool breeze swept through the trees, carrying the scent of something clean, something that didn't belong in decay. The fog began to lift slowly, as if drawn upward by invisible hands. A path appeared, not one we had seen before, but unmistakably clear, lined with stones and stripped of overgrowth. It stretched forward, gently sloping upward toward what looked like a ridgeline. I shook the others awake. We moved slowly, silently. No one questioned it, no one spoke. We just followed. As we reached the top of the ridge, the trees began to thin. And then, just as the sky began to shift from gray to pale morning light, we saw it. A trail of footprints in the mud, fresh, leading downhill. A voice in the distance, faint but unmistakable. Human. Then another. Barking dogs. A radio crackling. We stepped into the clearing, blinking against the sudden brightness. And there they were. Men in uniform. Locals in high boots. Search parties. Rescue workers. Their faces lit up the moment they saw us. They ran toward us, shouting, helping, wrapping us in blankets, offering water, speaking in fast, urgent tones. One man gripped my arm gently and said in perfect English, "We've been looking for you for days. You're safe now. You're home." It took weeks for my body to recover. The bruises faded faster than the thoughts. Sleep came in broken fragments, and even when I closed my eyes, I could still feel the damp air of the cave clinging to my lungs. The jungle never really left me. Not in the way it moved, not in the way it watched, and certainly not in what it had shown me. But I returned home. I carried a notebook filled with smudged pages, sketches, fragmented thoughts, and a memory I wasn't sure anyone would believe. The strangest part was not the darkness, or the fear, or even the moment we thought we would never come out alive. It was how deeply, after everything, I missed the silence. Not the silence of being alone, but the ancient kind, the kind that had surrounded us deep in that forest. A silence that held stories older than language, and eyes that had seen too many generations walk by without ever really understanding. Back in the US, the familiarity of traffic lights and grocery aisles felt almost surreal. There were days when I would sit quietly, staring out my window, wondering whether I had imagined it all. But then I'd flip through my journal, find dried mud pressed between pages, or recall the look on Max's face when the search team finally found us. I hadn't imagined anything. We had walked for hours after that moment on the ridge when we saw them, the search party, the dogs, the boots stomping toward us through tall grass. June had nearly collapsed from relief. Leo had cried silently, his hand gripping my shoulder so tightly it left bruises. Max, always composed, had finally sat down on a fallen log and didn't move for 20 minutes. They found Dylan 2 days later. He had wandered far, disoriented and dehydrated, emerging from a different part of the forest entirely, barefoot and without his backpack. He couldn't remember everything. Bits of time were missing, and the last thing he recalled was touching the center of the altar and feeling the floor pull beneath him like water. After we were stabilized and questioned, gently, respectfully, the Vietnamese officials gave us room to process. Not once did they mock or dismiss our experiences. In fact, one officer, older than the rest and clearly someone of rank, simply nodded when we struggled to explain what we'd seen. He offered us tea and said, almost kindly, "There are places in this country older than memory. Some things are not to be known, only witnessed." He never asked for our footage. When I returned home, the first thing I did after unpacking was walk across the street to Mr. Franklin's house. His porch looked the same, faded wood, creaky swing, the same chipped coffee mug on the railing. He was there, of course, as if he had never moved since the day I left. He looked up when he saw me, and for a long moment, we said nothing. Then he nodded, once, and gestured to the empty chair beside him. I sat. There were no greetings, no "how was your trip?" He waited until I was ready. I told him everything, not all at once, but in pieces, the way you unravel a tangled thread. He didn't interrupt. His eyes never left the horizon, but his fingers clenched his cup tighter with every word. I told him about the cave, the symbols, the silence that hummed with memory. I told him about Dylan disappearing, and how we found the hut with the dog tags still resting in the rusted box. I told him about the strange air in the forest, how the GPS never worked, and how something, whether spirit or history or ancient will, had allowed us to come back. When I was done, and we sat for a long time without speaking, the sun was low, casting amber light across the neighborhood lawns. Finally, he exhaled, a long, slow breath like he'd been holding it since 1971. "I used to dream," he he said softly, that someone would come back from that place with answers. I turned to him. But now, he continued, I think it was never about answers. Just echoes. His eyes looked wet, but not from grief. From some deeper ache, one that had no clear name. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph again, the same one he'd shown me before. This time, he handed it to me. They said he was probably taken, captured, maybe died in a cave somewhere. He pointed to one of the soldiers, young, smiling, unaware, but I always wondered if it was something else, something that didn't follow the rules of war, something the jungle kept. I looked at the face in the photo, then at the image in my mind. The dog tag, the cave, the name scratched onto metal with time and moss. I didn't say it aloud, but we both knew. It had been him. I never got to bury him, Mr. Franklin said quietly. Never even saw a casket, just a folded flag. We sat as the sky darkened. I wanted to say something comforting, something that would lift that weight from his shoulders, but he beat me to it. I envy your friend, he said after a while. Dylan, for getting to come back. His voice didn't tremble, but it carried a kind of sadness that had calcified into something sharper. Regret not just for what had happened, but for what had been impossible for his generation. To be seen, to be heard, to be saved. He didn't add, and now I can rest easy. He didn't need to. The sorrow in his tone said something else entirely. Something like, we never had the chance to come home whole, and now I've lived long enough to see another generation face what we faced, and return. We didn't talk much after that, but he asked me, almost casually, to write it down one day. Not for the world, just for anyone willing to read with humility. I promised him I would. Weeks passed, and life returned to its usual pace. The others scattered across countries, lives, jobs. We stayed in touch, loosely, the way people do after sharing something unforgettable and unrepeatable. Dylan slowly regained fragments of memory. Sometimes when we spoke, he'd say he remembered music. Not real music, but something melodic, echoing in the rocks. June returned to her quiet apartment and started painting again. Her canvases were strange now, twists of color and form that somehow looked like trees, caves, and thoughts. Max never said much, but he sent me a compass one day with a note. Still spins, but I like it that way. Leo wrote a book, not about the trip, but about the silence between stories. He dedicated it to what the forest chose not to take. As for me, I continued teaching, writing, traveling, but I never entered a jungle again, not out of fear, out of reverence, out of respect for the spirits and the silence and the soil that remembered far more than I ever could. Vietnam, for all its mystery, had welcomed us. It had allowed us to enter, shown us something sacred, and let us leave alive. That was more grace than anyone could ask for, and when people ask me now, was it worth it? I say yes. Not because we found answers, but because we found each other. Because in the middle of something we couldn't understand, we held on. And because when the forest finally let us go, we were met not with suspicion or shame, but with open arms, warm voices, and people who searched not because they had to, but because they chose to. There's a kind of peace in being found,